Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here to listen and open God's Word together. And we've already prayed that He will bless His Word to us so we can dig straight in. It's pretty evident and clear all around us that at the moment everybody is going through different things in their lives as individuals. Everyone has different troubles they're dealing with, and with the troubles come different sufferings. And there's a vast amount of different sufferings that entails. There's people that are maybe still suffering from something from years ago. It could be something of news this morning that somebody has had, and it's something that is really difficult on the heart to be able to grasp and to deal with. And I know that sometimes it can be difficult because we often have lots of people around us who are very willing and loving to be able to want to help and do what they can. And sometimes it's not always that simple, is it? There's a difference, and you've maybe heard it before, between sympathy and empathy. And I have a diagram here. It's not maybe very clear to those standing at the back, but it's a very simple diagram. I'll just explain what it is. A simple drawing of what somebody has done to demonstrate the difference. And this is sympathy, and there's a big cavity here of a hole with somebody at the bottom of the hole. And then there's somebody at the top looking down in the hole. And they're saying, "I'm so sorry you're in this hole. I'm so sorry." And that's true, isn't it? We can have sympathy for somebody from afar sometimes, or even from close. But there's a difference between sympathy and empathy. Empathy is somebody who has gone down to be with them in the hole. Somebody who is there with them. And this person is saying, "It's so dark in here. How are you coping?" Suddenly the whole perspective changes when you're actually with that person and you're experiencing to some extent what they're experiencing. Up top, they could say, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that you're in there," but they really didn't understand or grasp the emotions and what was going on until they're actually down in there with them. And this here, they're holding their hand down in there. They're suffering with them. They're feeling the extent of the darkness and the gravity of what is going on to some better degree being with them. So that's the difference there. And I know last time that I was able to open His Word with you, we mentioned about Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws, and that's a very simple, easy example, really, of empathy, how they could actually all understand what each other was going through, because they had all experienced loss on the same, in very similar ways, and so they could have empathy with each other. They could sit with each other and understand each other's difficulties and sufferings. Another example is just even in some of the more simpler things, but yet they still mean something. Like Jeff had to go down and help his daughter Lisa. They had flooding in the basement, and he could have got on the phone and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, and I hope it all works out for you." But he didn't. He went down there and he felt some of the pain and the stress that Lisa and the family were feeling for having that water in the basement, and he was there with them, helping them sort it out. So it can be on everyday things, and it can be on big events that can change our lives, that people can have this kind of empathy towards one another. So I'd like to turn to Psalm chapter 56 together. Psalm chapter 56. And we're actually just going to read one verse here, and it's verse 8. And before I read it, just to give the context, this was when this was David in a psalm describing some of his suffering in a time in his life when he was under great threat and persecution from his enemies. And verse 8 reads, "Record my lament, list my tears on your scroll. Are they not in your record?" Now this is in the NIV version. However, I'd also like to read the NLT version just to give different words to it for us to think about here, and Noah has kindly offered to read that from his Bible for us.
You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book.
Can you read that one more time?
You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book.
Thank you, Noah. This version just, to me, helps us get a little bit more of a sense of what is going on here. God is able to keep track of every little detail that we're suffering with, and he keeps track of it in a book. And he bottles up all those tears. He understands, he collects them all. And he knows there's not a tear he doesn't know about, is the point here. And there's not a thing that goes on that he doesn't understand. I don't know if any of you have ever tried keeping records of things, whether it's something like when a baby is born and you're keeping track of the first steps, the first words. We were never very good at that. Sorry, guys. But it's similar to that. There's keeping track of all those moments in our life. God understands every moment. Every time that something goes wrong, that we're suffering with, He's there, and He's been there. And so He understands the extent of what we're going to. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17, it says, "For all light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." So these troubles and things that go on are to be expected, but it's even though they don't feel light, and they don't feel like they're gonna stop, that they are in the gravity, in the extent of eternity, that only momentary, and what we go through is something that is going to be reflected in eternity from how we go through it, and it outweighs what we may be going through at the time. Our good friend Dagri, when I was talking with her last time, she was reminding us that if if on in the hospital, if you have a flat wave, a flat line, it means you're dead. And if the monitor is going up and down, you know that means you're still alive. And so there is going to be ups and downs in our lives, and that's just a sign that we are alive, we are living, we're not dead. And it's a very good point that she mentioned there. And so it is to be expected that we're going to have these difficulties and these sufferings. And it's going to be difficult because sometimes we're not necessarily going to have people around us who understand, who have been there before and can relate to these things. Yesterday was a pretty sad day for LFC, the Liverpool Football Club. Just to give a brief background, basically Liverpool, the soccer team, have for years now been in usually the top category of the Premier League. They're usually one of the strongest teams and have been the strongest on some years. And yesterday they were playing the bottom team in the Premier League and they lost. And yes, it's just a game. And in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter at all. So to what meets the eye originally, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But what we don't know, or what we sometimes forget is, now after this game, many of these players, many of these people involved are now going to get masses of hate mail and threats and things that we don't understand, things that we don't think about. And whilst this is a common thing that happens, and some of these players are used to it by now, these are things that happen behind scenes that we don't know about. I can't understand what that must be like. I know I've had people who don't like me before, but I've not had masses of hate mail come with threats and not sure if I'm safe to walk down the street because of what I did the day before. But their teammates understand. Each of those players, they know how that situation feels, and they're all in the same boat together. They can have empathy with one another that this is a big deal. Even though it was just a game, they've got these consequences now to deal with because of this that might not go away necessarily right away. And thankfully there's lots of security in place that usually nothing ever comes to harm for players, thankfully. But it's just an example of behind scenes things that can go on that sometimes you don't think about that people are going through. And there's lots of things here in each of our lives, some big, some small, that each of us don't understand or we don't know about, that are going on, that are sometimes difficult to deal with. And sometimes it feels like we don't have anybody around us to help us or sympathize with these things. But do we though? We have Jesus Christ, who has gone ahead of us, who has suffered ahead of us, and he has been through it all ahead of us to understand what it is like to go through these difficulties. And we've been thinking about it this morning, that he made himself last, he made himself nothing, and he went through all of these things, that he can actually have empathy and for us, and he can understand, and he can be there in the darkness with us. He can hold our hand and he can help us with these things. sometimes we have things that happen that are not fair, and we can be suffering through it all, but there's blessings behind it that are far greater than we realize. Yesterday, a few of the guys here went and did a cross-country competitive race in Blue Mountains there, and they tried hard and they did really well. And unfortunately, Reuben had he came fifth at the end, which was really good. However, afterwards he was telling us about unfortunate events where the two players ahead of him had actually cheated in the race, and therefore had that effect on the potential for him to get that third place medal that he had gone and put the effort in to make. And Reuben could have actually done the exact same thing as those other two ahead of him, cheated in the same way, and he chose not to. And I told him that sometimes that it was just a medal, and that what he did in keeping that integrity to keep racing the proper way far outweighed getting that third place medal. And whilst it was unfortunate, I felt his pain, I felt the suffering of all the efforts he went to go and try his best, and then it was thwarted by people not sticking to the rules. But sometimes there's blessings. Reuben will be blessed for being able to keep running the race according to plan, and I think he understands that despite it being upsetting at the time. So there's sometimes there's good things that can come out of it, of suffering. Sometimes we can be tested in ways that we don't want to be, but then if we come out of things in the correct way, with these blessings to be had for this. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 10, it says, "And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you had suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast." I don't know how many of you have ever done a lot of work with your hands in terms of outdoor work and things like that, but you'll find the first time you do it that you can get blisters pretty bad on your hands, and it can hurt quite a lot. But after time, those blisters and the skin becomes really hard, and you get calluses on your hands, and your hands become really tough. And so after the suffering of all the pain of having the soft hands, you then get those firmer hands that when you're up against sharp objects, you don't actually even get a cut from it. My hands used to be a lot more that way from the work I did, but the work I do now, they've gone a little softer again. So I don't like that side of it, but that's just an example that sometimes the sufferings we go through, overall it can spiritually make us firmer and tougher for future things that can come our way. And so here we started with the Psalms here, and any of the people in the Bible here would have gone through at least some kind of suffering, because everybody is born into suffering of some kind. This was just an example of David. There's many examples we can use from him, and they point very nicely towards a lot of things we can think about Christ in the New Testament. But one of the things that really intrigued me about reading this psalm initially wasn't the actual verses themselves, but the notes above verse 1. It said, "For the director of music to the tunes of A Dove on Distant Oaks" of David. It was A Dove on Distant Oaks that caught my attention. This tune called A Dove on Distant Oaks. And it made me consider or reflect on how maybe David was thinking a little bit about when Noah was in the boat with his family, and there was flooding, and the whole world flooded, and they were awaiting for land to appear. And that Noah and his family, they could have empathy with one another because they'd seen the suffering of mankind for the wrong they'd done. And nobody wanted to watch all these people drown. Nobody wanted to be there and see that. And nobody wanted to be in a boat for days and days all alone. And here we have this tune titled A Dove on Distant Oaks. That title that just shouts hope, just like when Noah was sending the birds out and finally came back with some branches in its beak, but it was from afar away. And here we have David in the midst of a circumstance where he's suffering, and he's feeling like he's all alone, and hope might seem far away, but he knows it's there. He knows it's there, and God's going to help him through the suffering and to pull him out on the other side. So just to wrap up, I just have an actual practical thing to do together here. I have with me here a cross, which is obviously familiar to everybody in the room here, and I have some pieces of paper, and what I'd like to do is I'm going to hand each one of you a post-it note, just like this, and on the back where it's sticky, just write at the bottom just one thing or a couple things if you want that you're really suffering with. Nobody is going to read it. This is going to get crumpled up and put in Jeff and Katie's garbage after. But just write it down at the bottom and then fold it up to where just before the sticky bit, and I'll come by and collect it back from you in a second. I'm just going to hand these out. So here we have a lot of suffering from something from everybody here in the church. And this is just reminding us that Christ has also suffered with us, and he understands. He knows what we're suffering. He knows the pain, and he's got the empathy to be there with us. We're just gonna listen to a song together now to finish.
Let us rejoice in Christ the Lord, who makes our cause his own. The hope that's built upon his word can never be overthrown. Though many foes beset us round, and feeble is our arm, our life is hid with Christ in God, beyond the reach of harm. Weak as we are, we shall not faint, or fainting shall not fail. Jesus, the strength of every saint, forever must prevail. Though now he's unperceived by sense, faith sees him always near. A guide, a glory, a defense, to save from every fear. As surely as he overcame and conquered death and sin, so shall